All right, I've got about 15 minutes to get a session in. As always, daily sessions are going to include weight bearing on my hands, some hand balancing, but today we're going to continue the focus on shoulder extension. So that's trying to get my hips in front of my hands. And that's going to help with things like power moves for breakdancing. Obviously, pretty much anything on my hands is going to be helpful for jujitsu. And it's also just something that I haven't spent a lot of time on in the past, and anything that I'm bad at interests me. So, without further ado, here we go. We got 15 minutes to work. Let's make it count. All right. So, as always, I like to start off pretty much any session with a little bit of weight bearing on my hands, some static positions, basically just plank. I've got 15 minutes to work today, so 5 minutes of it's going to be the plank, and then I'm going to spend the additional 10 minutes on skill work and some strength conditioning work, which we'll get into here in 5 minutes. But let's go ahead and get started on this because we are running on a time constraint. And if you've never watched any of my content before, or if you've never watched any of this long form content where you've seen me explain why I do this, the reason I'm in a plank or holding static positions like this at the beginning of each one of my sessions is to serve as sort of a warm-up to prime my body for weight bearing on my hands, weight bearing on my elbows and shoulders, but also this is my form of assessment. This is how I check in with my body to say, hey, what's going on? How does this feel? And then wait for the response before deciding what I'm going to do for the day. Because I've been doing this long enough now where I've definitely tried just pushing through, or rather mindlessly kind of plugging away at a program or a plan of action, and then getting the negative consequences of that. So this is my opportunity each and every day to check in and say, hey, am I capable of the thing that I'm about to try to do? And sometimes you got to be prepared for the answer to be no. Like today could be an example of that. So I'm checking in, I'm seeing, hey, how does weight bearing on my hands feel? Because although my training usually leaves me feeling pretty good and prepared for the next day's training, there are a lot of things that I can't control outside of my training that can impact how that next day is going to go and how that session is going to feel. So things like, day-to-day living, chores, jiu-jitsu is a big one for me. It's just not a very controlled environment, and so you can't decide every single range of motion that every body part's in and the intensity associated with that. A lot of it's just kind of happening to you, so you don't know until you know. So each day sort of check in, and this is my way of doing it for hand balancing and for upper body. This is really kind of a full body practice, but for me to really check in mostly for my hands, my elbows, my shoulders, because those are the areas where I've run into issues in the past. But this can be applied to anything, like before squatting heavy, right? Maybe walk around a little bit, do some body weight squats, check in with your body. But it's a pretty simple concept, right? I'm just going to do the light version of something before I do the heavy version to see if there's any snags, if there's any red flags, because if you can't do the light version without problems, what makes you think you'd be able to do the heavy version? It's just common sense, but common sense that's often not applied, and I've definitely been guilty of not applying it in the past. So we're about 3 minutes in. I still will get comments from people kind of expressing that they think, well, 5 minutes is like way too long to hold a plank. You might be right. Like it might be way too long for you. I've built up to this. I find this to be a comfortable amount of time. I feel like less time is fine. I would still be able to get a good session in. But I feel like 5 minutes gives me a chance not only to test and see how my hands and my wrists, elbows, shoulders, how my scapula, all of that is going to respond to weight bearing and to movement for the day, but also it gives me a chance to kind of work on some stuff too. And a lot of times I'll use this to fit in some like lower body stretching, some mobilization, because as long as I've got my hands on the floor, I still consider this to be part of my sort of assessment and warm up. So I'm just seeing at the end of this 5 minutes, did I run into any pain? Did I run into any discomfort? But throughout that 5 minutes, I can still be productive. Like I can still work on progressing things or continuing to prepare my body for the other aspects of that training. So, for example, today, since I'm going to be doing some shoulder extension work, switching over to like a reverse tabletop makes sense to start to stretch out my anterior side, anterior delt, so that way it's not tight and restricting me from being able to get into this hips in front of hands position, but also starting to kind of prime my posterior delts and my triceps to be able to support weight and hold my body in this shape. So giving my body a little taste of the low intensity option before I start attempting the high intensity option. Again, when you say it out loud, it's like common sense. Like, who wouldn't do that? Me in the past. So sometimes just having a little reminder can make all the difference. So there's our 5 minutes. Like I said, no big deal. 5 minutes of holding a static position, that's easy. We do that all the time, just generally from standing. So just kind of getting used to different shapes. All right, so I'm going to cut the video here so you guys don't have to see me rearrange the gym, and then we'll be back shortly. All right, welcome back. So it's only been about 30 seconds to a minute. I just had to pull up the mats. That way I have a more stable surface to work on. If you can, try to set up your environment to make your training as accessible as possible, so that way you're more likely to do it and that we get the most out of it. So we're still on track to kind of stick with that 15-minute constraint that we've set for ourselves. 5 minutes of warm-up and assessment out of the way. So today we're going to be working on shoulder extension. Shoulder extension is whenever my hips are in front of my hands, essentially. So it's anytime my hands are behind my back, or when I'm taking my hands in this direction is the action of shoulder extension. When you're doing that under load, it's really challenging because it's something that we just don't get a lot of exposure to. So we don't get a lot of XP for shoulder extension throughout our day-to-day lives, just because there's not a lot of activities that really require this. Most everything that we interact with is in front of us, and when we do interact with it in front of us, generally we're using a lifting motion to interact with it, not a pushing down motion, which would be what we would use for shoulder extension. So it's a tough thing to kind of integrate, and that's the reason I'm doing it in my sessions. And to kind of get back to how I choose what I do during my sessions and the intensities and how much I do of each movement, it really comes down to if I can integrate it into my daily life, it doesn't need to be in my sessions. So I save this time for the things that are the hardest to integrate, like shoulder extension. And then what specifically the movements I'm doing and how much, that just comes down to what I'm capable of at that time, like at that point in time. And that can actually vary in both directions. I can make progress and I can also regress. So that's why I do an assessment at the beginning of the session, because there's no way I can just know, looking at a notebook, exactly what I'm capable of today. There's just no way. I could be a little bit better than I was before. It could be a little bit worse, and that's why I check in ahead of time. So when I'm going through and I'm choosing the movements for that day's session, a lot of it I'm determining during that initial assessment. It's kind of figuring out like what makes sense. And of course I've got a game plan. Like today I definitely wanted to work on shoulder extensions on the canes, and specifically I'm building up to more of like a V-sit, L-sit. So I've got a really good kind of framework in mind of what I want to do and how I want to spend that time, but the specifics of it are all determined based on the assessment that I do each day. So here we go. I've got 10 minutes to work. Now, generally, I try to fill that time with as much quality work as possible. So for today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to spend most of the 10 minutes with my hips in front of my hands. And then I'm just going to use varying degrees of intensity. So that's going to range anywhere from basically fully supported on my feet to zero support, and then also getting my hips further in front of my hands. And so this might seem like a little strange to people where it's like, oh, where are the sets? Where are the reps? It's just total accumulated time in front of my hips. The more, the better. And the further I can go, the better as well. So you don't really need to be super strict, and you also don't need to be super prescriptive about that because you're really just guessing at best. So here we go. Like I said, I just want to really spend more time with my hips in front of my hands. And even here, even in a foot supported position like this, I'm already doing a lot of work. My posterior delts are working to keep my arms in this position. My triceps are working pretty hard just to keep me loaded up on a straight arm. And then I'm also utilizing a lot of scapular depression, which is really, really useful for all forms of hand balancing because it's what keeps you elevated away from the floor. And it's what allows you to change shapes and control yourself, is being able to push away like this. So even at the beginning here, it already feels like a lot of work, but I'm already a minute and a half in. So if you think about, wow, I just accumulated a minute and a half in this position. If I were repping these out, it would have taken me 5 sets of 10 to accumulate a minute or minute and a half. So isometrics like this, it's kind of a cheat code if the goal is to improve or become more comfortable in specific positions. All right, so I don't want to hang out there in the lowest intensities only. So while I'm still a little fresh and we're pretty close to the beginning here, I'm going to start working on some higher intensity stuff. All right. Now, it's not that I don't count reps or I don't keep metrics. That would be silly. I'm a gamer and I love to gamify things, and having metrics is a big part of that. It's just that I have a little bit more of an open mind about what metrics I'm using and how I'm using them. For example, right there was like a 7-second sort of tucked V-sit, and that's great. Like I could try to do that every single time the exact same way, but just for longer. But there's more variables than just the length of time that I can hold it. There is also how far I can press up into it. And you might think like, well, just press up as high as possible every single time. Well, that's what I'm trying to do, but depending on if I'm doing other activities like a low intensity version of the movement like this first, or if I'm giving myself lots of rest, there's lots of variables that are going to impact how high and for how long. So instead of sticking just a single metric where I can only train a specific way to be able to see progress, instead try a lot of different methods and keep track of a lot of different metrics. For example, what is like the length of time I can hold my hips up whenever I'm keeping my hips in front of my hands for the entire 10 minutes, and how many times can I do that? And so I usually like to use total accumulated time, and that tends to give me a better idea of what I'm capable of than any one specific rep can, for the most part, for most skills. So I'm at about 7 seconds right now. I'm going to try to get to about 30 seconds first as a kind of goal for max time held with my hips as high as possible. So here we go. I'm at about 7 seconds now, and we're just now approaching minute 5. So here we go. All right, 10 seconds. So starting to break a little sweat now. It's a good thing. You definitely want to be sweating while you're training. If you're not, you're probably very dehydrated, or you're probably not training very hard. And what's so great about spending like long periods of time in a specific position is that your body will kind of naturally start to accept the position. Like you'll start to feel less and less resistance to being in it. Like this isn't a very normal position to be in. Usually we're not in very much extension at all. We spend a lot of our time and flexed at the hips, at the knees, spine, elbows, shoulders. But in this extended position, I'm starting to feel a little bit more comfortable now. So we're about at 17 seconds total right now for our hips in front of hands, as high as they can go. Let's see if we can add a little bit to that now. All right, it's another 10 seconds or so. Probably should have just went straight through to 30. That would have made more sense. But, you know, it's okay. We're going to get more opportunities. And it's just a nice round number. There's no other magic to getting to 30 seconds on that rep. Okay. So we got about 3.5 minutes left. That means I've been working for about 6.5 minutes. And in 6.5 minutes, I've accumulated 27 seconds at the highest sort of tuck V-sit that I could hold. But I've also accumulated all the remainder of that time in front of my hands. So in shoulder extension, extending my shoulders. So I'm just getting tons of accumulation of exposure, and that's just going to help make this position more comfortable and help me get more out of it in future reps, future sessions. So future uses of the position. All right, well, we got to get that 30, but I'm thinking with the time we have left, could definitely get to a minute. Got 2.5 minutes left. No big deal. So let's shoot for 40 seconds on this one. So that would be an extra, that'd be a 13-second hold. All right. That was about 13 seconds. Okay, so that means we got about 20 seconds left if I want to hit that goal of 1 minute. Although any goal like that is a little arbitrary, since there's no standard for like what is good and what isn't. It's all subjective. But generally, I find that if I can get 1 minute of solid exposure to a position, a movement, a skill in a session, that's enough to make progress. If I'm challenging myself, if I'm doing the challenging version of it, a challenging version of it by my standards, and I accumulate a minute of exposure to that in a session, a minute to 2 minutes, that's really that's all you need. That's all you need to be able to make progress. And honestly, you can make progress with less, but that's kind of a standard I set for myself as kind of a baseline goal for whenever I'm training most skills. All right, we got a minute 20 left, and we need 20 seconds still. So let's see if we can do 2 10-second holds. All right, it's about 10 seconds. Hips are definitely not going up as high as they were at the beginning. It's a good sign. It means I'm challenging myself. Definitely sweating a lot more now. Another good sign. And then we need 10 more seconds of exposure, and we've got 45 seconds left. All right. Whew. We're just going to knock it all out in one set. So whatever this looks like, this will be the last one. Here we go. Oh. 10 seconds left. I'll call this a little victory lap. I'm just going to hang out here for my last 10 seconds. Whew. And there it is. That felt really good. 15 minutes. That's all that was. 15 minutes. I got a good warm up. I got a a great session. A lot of work for various skills, specifically the attributes of weight bearing on my hands, which has become a daily practice for me. I have to put weight on my hands every single day. Also, hand balancing, which has become a daily practice for me as well over the last 2 years. And it's only thanks to that first practice that I'm able to do that. And then also this new goal of working on shoulder extension so that I can finally start to make progress on some of my other goals that require it. So sometimes you just got to plug away. But so still a very short, concise session, very fun, very effective. And again, it's really about that total accumulated exposure to the position, to the skill, to that intensity. That's really going to elicit an adaptation. And so think about that as a way to sort of open your mind up to different ways that you can approach the same problem. And at that, I'm going to go ahead and knock out one handstand because although I do count L-sits and V-sits as hand balancing, I just like doing handstands. So here we go. We'll do a max handstand hold. My arms are so incredibly fatigued, especially the triceps, so we'll see how this looks. My ceilings are a little too low, so I gotta kind of, change shapes. Whoa. Okay, wow, my arms are so toast. And I have no timer set, so I really don't know how long I'm going for here, but it doesn't matter. I mean, do you ask yourself how many seconds you stood up throughout the day? No, it's arbitrary. Okay. I think that's better stop while I'm ahead. So, go ahead and bring it down. Okay. Great session. Thanks, guys. I will catch you next time.